online, and we're really pleased to welcome you to this event. Thanks to Alicia for organising all of this. It's a really nice opportunity for us. As she mentioned, I'm research director here, so an economist, unfortunately, not a natural scientist of any type. But so we're just fascinated to hear your view on life in terms of operations and how we can help. Just a little bit of background in terms of Bidwell's. We're a multidisciplinary advisory business across the Oxford-Cambridge arc. We've got, this is our head office here, but we've got offices in Oxford, Cambridge, Milton Keynes, London, and Norwich. We cover a sort of range of aspects, but in the area of life science, technology, high-end manufacturing is really important part of our business. So we're involved in the sale of buildings, leasing buildings, and importantly, project management, building consultancy. And unfortunately, I've got a technical person in the room from our team as well, who, if there are any questions on that side as well. So the full gamut, and we've also actually in our renewal business is quite strong with a strong presence in Scotland. That's growing very quickly. Just in terms of the event, we would like this to be very much interactive and a good discussion. I mean, what we want to do is think about real estate in terms of having a positive take of what we can do to support the sector and a trajectory of growth going forward. So we want it to be a positive influence, and we're very aware in a very difficult market in many locations that you might operate is actually it's a challenge a lot of the times. We'd like to have a discussion how we make that a positive experience and what we can do. Excuse me. I hope you'll be generous and honest with your thoughts. It's a relatively small group, and plus we've got people online, so please be open. And I have absolutely no doubts, knowing the characters, that our panel will be equally as frank, and we'll have a good discussion. Do chip in as we go along. It's going to be informal. I'm going to do a presentation very briefly in just a second, but before that, if I could just introduce our panel. Ros Bird, who is at Norwich Research Park, but previously at Silverstone and previously Cambridge, Milton Keynes, and a number of other places. But I'll ask them all to introduce themselves properly in a minute. Doug Cuff, who is just back from Boston on Monday, I think, with IQHQ, and he can give a bit more detail there as well. We have Robert from Cambridge Innovation Capital, who is on the financing side. I know a number of you will know him and will have been involved from the financing side that they offer, but particularly from Cambridge University side. And also Michael Chen on the end there, who's our business. And I hope you'll be very frank as you were when we were discussing things just a minute ago.
Not too frank.
Okay, that's unfortunate. Nuclear. So welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm just going to sort of kick off with just a couple of slides. Here we go. In terms of just a top-level view of, I suppose, how real estate views the world from your perspective. So there's no science in this whatsoever. It's more an economist view of the world. But and I suppose a lot of the content will be focused on Oxford and Cambridge, but in terms of some of the charts, but the points are generic. I don't think they're specialist to this particular market. Thankfully, a number of my predecessors had the wherewithal to collect data from many decades, which you probably appreciate. So I've got the benefit of a really long time span, long before a number of these sectors were even dreamt of. So we can kind of track what's going on in the market. So from the big thing that's happened in the real estate world over the last couple of years is this enormous volume of capital that has entered the market, trying to invest and actually investing in the real estate sector. So the chart we have on the left-hand side here shows the volume of transactions into the office and lab sector across the arc. And we can see that enormous increase in 2021. Now, there is clearly a pandemic impact there, but actually it started. So we were having conversations with a number of investors looking to build exposure to the life science market in particular, but also tech as well, during the period in 2019, 2020. In fact, probably the last meeting Max and I went to was with a big investor looking for exposure before the lockdown. And I suppose during the pandemic period, after that sort of initial panic, then we started to see both assets coming forward, which was clearly an important part of it, but also that the appetite and demand from investors to have exposure to this exciting market. The chart on the right-hand side there shows where that capital is coming from. And the big story really in 2021 was that increase in terms of overseas capital, in particular private equity and other forms, but it's the overseas equity. And that continues as well. I suppose another point actually to just mention on that is we kind of expected things would slow down in 2022, just because it couldn't continue at that pace, and actually that appetite has continued and has remained over the summer. And of course, the reason for that is the level of demand and really trying to capture a market, as we would call it, a sector that sees this high growth potential. I come from a background in previous employer really focused on financial business services in the City of London, central London. If we look at the growth trajectory of that sector and we look at it for life science, R&D, engineering, it's a very different picture. So you kind of understand all the analysts in the property, real estate, capital market side really focusing on where the growth is there. So in this chart here, we're tracking floor space requirements. So this is the quantum of floor space requirements for office and laboratories, and then broken down by sector. And I think there's probably 2 points. One, traditional sectors, so financial business services, really is showing a very slow pace of particularly life science, but also other scientific areas that pulled out there. And I think probably what's interesting on the other scientific is that it's starting to get to a quantum now that we actually pull that out separately. So there's some interesting trends in there in terms of environmental R&D and the agri-tech side as well. The other bit is of course the IT side. I don't like that term, but I was told by an analyst I need to use it. So, but it does kind of capture what I'm going to talk about in a moment. But that sort of technology side as well, and the manufacturing, all of that is linked. As we will see in a second. And so this is the sort of bad news story that I don't actually really want to focus on, because we can all agree that there isn't enough stock, and I know many of you will be sitting in a sort of challenged by it and much rather be getting on with more interesting things in your lives, rather than worrying about how to expand in the floor space and where you're going to go for that. But just look at the 2 pictures. I think there's a couple of points I want to pick out here. One, in Oxford, there's 18,000 square feet, and that might have already gone. So this was at the end of June in terms of lab space available. So virtually, there's no space in either market. Clearly, things come and go a little bit, but there's nothing compared to the scale of the stock. But I think the other point that's quite interesting here is the pace at which Oxford has accelerated and really driven forward. So where Cambridge has over the last decade, I suppose well, actually over the last 5 years, has seen just over 50% increase in terms of lab floor space. Oxford hasn't seen that pace of stock, but it has seen the pace of requirements increase at a very, very similar rate to Cambridge. So life science going from even when we started tracking total floor space by sector in 2018, when it was something like 25%, I think, it's now over 30% of total floor space in Oxford. So it's a really strong growth there, and obviously happening very quickly. only held back by the fact that there isn't stock there to supply it. And I suppose why is it, given that picture and the mismatch between supply and demand, is why don't we all kind of give up and go somewhere else? And it's this ecosystem story. And I suppose this is the thing I'd quite like to bring up in our discussion, is really how we might be able to translate some of those positive characteristics that we see here and think about those in other parts of the UK, not just in this area, but also other parts of the UK as well. So this chart is based on a survey we undertook at the end of last year with YouGov. It's a survey of large R&D companies. So they're global companies with a presence in the UK, and really asking their locational preferences, what's driving them in terms of the space they needed, what are their future plans, and what kind of space they're going to think they might need as their science evolves over the next five plus years, which is a tricky question, I suspect. But we got some, and there is a report around. I'm kind of loath to actually promote a Life Science 2030 report to a group of scientists, if I'm honest with you, but you're very welcome to see it and focus on the chart at the end rather than the science bit, actually. But we've got it's a fairly nice picture in terms of what's driving it, and there's some interesting stories that came out of it in terms of the mix of sort of preference for wet lab space compared to dry lab space going forward, and the need for flexibility, a word I suspect we'll come back to quite a lot during this discussion. Anyway, so part of this survey, we asked them what are their plans over the next 5 years, and clearly what their preference would be for those who actually want to expand is to stay where they are and just expand in their existing location, whether that be take additional space where they are or just find an alternative location. And certainly if we look at a lot of the large letting transactions, say in Cambridge Science Park, there are companies moving regularly, or even around Cambridge, and same in Oxford as well, moving to larger and larger spaces as they become available. And then one of the other points coming out in terms of this ecosystem is the recruitment retention, which I'm sure is very close to your hearts, the proximity to business collaborators and proximity to academic and clinical collaborators. So all of those points will be very clear to you, but it's from a real estate perspective, it's interesting and I suppose challenging at the same time, because actually the geography of that is really quite tight in markets which are already quite tight. And just a point, really kind of finishing up on the collaboration side. So, that need to be near collaborators, and that's a driving force in terms of location decision making. But I think, there is a risk that from a real estate perspective, we're a little bit too general about this and understanding the nature of the market. Now, I just had a very interesting discussion on chemistry and the specific requirements on chemistry. In our survey, we also asked, we were able to break it down by broad sectors. So life science, the real focus is this is why I had to use the word ICT, because it's how YouGov define it. But it's really that focus on the collaboration between tech and life science, whether it's AI drug discovery and a number of other areas. So that's who they want to be near, most important to them, more so than actually companies in their own sector. And then there's the other side of hardware as well, so which creates all kinds of other issues, because it's not only the office and lab market, it's a challenge in Oxford, Cambridge, and actually in London as well, and a number of other markets, but the industrial market is just as difficult. There are very few, in Cambridge, for example, there's very few traditional industrial occupiers in occupation anymore. It's been transformed by science and tech, so whether it's companies just making do with that space and repurposing it, or actually it's high-level manufacturing or pharmaceutical manufacturing. And then, of course, the other side of it, the R&D, other R&D sectors, which is obviously a very broad church, industrial, environmental, energy, and so I'm cautious about us generalising too much about who collaborates with who. I think that's quite important, but it's also a really interesting point when one is arranging, say, science parks in our world, in terms of who we might want there as occupiers, what is going to work together, who are going to collaborate together, and how that all works. And just another sort of snippet from the survey is this outsourcing issue as well. So this is a survey of large R&D, but importance to them is to be located near the companies that they're outsourcing to. And I'm sure that's a very familiar sort of story to many of you. 40% then also want it within an hour commute. That actually doesn't get you very far around here in traffic. So it again, it's a very tight circle in terms of that wider ecosystem. So I could actually go on for quite a long time because I've got lots of slides on that, but I won't for now. I'll pick out other points that might be of interest as we go along. What I would like to do now is to ask my panelists to come up to the front here and introduce themselves. And I think probably introduce themselves from the perspective of, I suppose, their sort of journey and kind of where real estate fits in that. And some of it's a real estate journey and some of it's less so, but it will be good to kind of have a sort of scene setting first, and then we can open up to discussion, if that's okay. Thank you. Yes, is that okay? Sorry, I was just doing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I'm Ros Bird. I'm the CEO of Anglo Innovation Partnership, and that's the science park management company at Norwich Research Park, where we've got the UEA, the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital, 3 BBSRC funded research institute, and the Sainsbury Laboratory. It's plant science applied to human health and crop resilience and production, looking at climate change and food security and UN development goals, really. It's I think Tony Jones was talking to me and saying from his point of view, it's a sort of new frontier of science in gene editing and genetic manipulation. 40 companies there in 100,000 square feet, 1.6 million square feet of planning consent. I started there in May, so forgive me that I haven't built anything speculatively yet, but that's the aim. Before that, just so you know that what I just said is true, I built 650,000 square feet speculative accommodation, slightly easier to justify in terms of it being industrial units, but for a market that I helped to create there of advanced engineers at Silverstone. Before that, I was at Granta Park, where there's 400,000 square foot of outline consent, and when we sold to BioMed, I just achieved reserve matters consent, I think was about to on a 43,000 square foot building. And before that, I was at the Science Park Association for 5 years, looking at good practice in science park management, how to kind of add value in a science park location to the community by being present, creating a community and creating a place where the companies that are based there find it easy to attract and retain staff, and it's a place that will impress their clients and their investors. So that's me.
Should I stand? Should I sit? I'll sit. I'm not feeling comfortable that way.
I was with a load of MPs last night. Stand up to talk.
It's not that formal. That's okay. So I think I'll start with kind of my journey, and then we'll go into IQHQ, because the IQHQ story is pretty short, but pretty impressive nonetheless, and they all tie together actually. So I spent my first job out at university. I worked for a biotech company in New York City, working in the lab, and didn't like it because I like being successful, and it was too much failure. So I moved on to real estate. And then I started working for BioMed Realty in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I worked for BioMed for 14 years. I came over in 2012 to 16 in Cambridge and took the reins from Ross at Granta Park and ran Granta Park up to 2019. During that time, we did 155,000 square foot pre-let to Lumina. We did a 95,000 square foot pre-let to Gilead. We did a 36,000 square foot office to lab conversion to Heptares, their agents in the office in the audience. We also did a 108,000 square foot transaction with the BBSRC, Abraham Research Park, and we also acquired 430 Cambridge Science Park as well. We also did the Apiary, which is a 40,000 square foot amenity building, which has a swimming pool, rock and wall, Peloton studio, you name it, it's got it. And so the team, after Blackstone acquired BioMed, a lot of the management left in 2016. I then left in 19, and we started IQHQ, which is, again, another life science developer. And we currently have 10 million square feet under speculative development over San Diego, San Francisco, Boston. And now we've just had our first acquisition in Cambridge, 120, 137, Cambridge Science Park. Michael is my tenant. And we're looking to grow and expand in the UK as well. That core team, Alan Gold's our chairman. Alan Gold's the chairman of BioMed. John Bonanno was the chief investment officer at BioMed. He's not the chief investment officer at IQHQ. So you can see the entrepreneurship kind of flowing from one organization to the other.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Robert.
Robert Anderson, partner in life science at Cambridge Innovation Capital. We're a venture fund which invests in, we say, knowledge-intensive businesses. We came out of the university, but our remit is anything within the Cambridge ecosystem with a substantive presence. And no disrespect to Norfolk counts as Cambridge ecosystem, as far as Stephen is probably Welling, but not Oxford, not Welling. And the kind of business we invest in, life science, across a whole spectrum, but also deep tech as well. My knowledge of real estate is very limited, other than some of the challenges that we face within this. But we have invested in a small subset of the companies in Cambridge, but that's still in the last 8 years constitutes 37 companies, which have raised over £2 billion in the last 8 years. And I think that kind of influx of capital and the requirements in order to grow and fulfill their ambition. And part of the remit why we were set up, and one of the challenges which we face in real estate is we want to develop sector-leading businesses on a global scale. And to be honest, the historic situation I started off I was a doctor at Addenbrooke's 25 odd years ago. And back then, the ambitions just wasn't there to create these leading translation at scale of the science that's coming out of Cambridge. Now that ambition is there, and how do we achieve it is something which we're very focused on.
All right. And standing on the shoulders here, because without these guys here at Nuclera wouldn't be possible. So I'm Michael Chen, co-founder and CEO at Nuclera. In a nutshell, we make proteins accessible by launching the world's first e-protein bioprinter. And the reason why it's important to make proteins accessible is because our customers say, in large pharma, that drug discovery starts with protein. So, for example, when you take ibuprofen, that targets a protein called cyclooxygenase in your body. But it turns out it's really, really difficult to get proteins. And that's how my fellow co-founders and I sort of stumbled upon this high-value problem of making proteins accessible. So we co-founded Nuclera back in 2013 as first-year PhD students out of the University of Cambridge, which is why I have an American accent here in Cambridge. I came here to study as a graduate student. And many of you may know, so one of my fellow co-founders, Gordon, and I were in the lab of Shankar Balsubramanian, who is another Cambridge success story because he co-founded Celexa, which later became the Illumina sequencing technology that dominates the life science sequencing market today. So the reason I have this box in front of me is because one of your, I found it really interesting when you say curating science parks. It's because Nuclera came about from large company, small company partnerships. And one of our large company, small company partnerships is with a display company out of Boston called E-Ink, which is popular for making this guy. So all the e-paper devices in the Kindle. And so we collaborated with them in order to make our cartridge that goes into our e-protein bioprinter. And through that strategic partnership, we expanded from our location in Cambridge, UK, to now our second location, Boston, Massachusetts, and we now have 120 people spread out amongst Boston and Cambridge, UK. So I guess the property story here is back in 2014, 15, when we started to graduate from our PhDs, the first office lab location we found, there were not many that served the 250 to 750 square foot size when we were looking for office labs. So we decided to go to the Stevenage Bioscience Catalyst that's just on the GST. And so we spent about a year there and got really tired of the commute from Cambridge to Stevenage and went back. So then we moved to 152 Cambridge Science Park that was just recently developed at that point back in 2017, 2018. And then subsequently then jumped into the old pharma building in 137 next to the Bradfield Center, and then found that when we finally had raised Series B financing, there was no space available. So we started to expand into various different facilities across the Cambridge Science Park, and then looked for a space to unify all of our facilities, but found that none was really available, especially laboratory space. We found a ton of office space was left empty, actually, by the pandemic. Next door, the Cambridge Business Park, probably 1 million square feet of space just sitting empty in terms of office space. No one really going in there, but there was no lab space to be found. And it was only by our good fortune that Doug here introduced us to an agent at JLL, which then resulted in a bespoke deal for us on the Vision Park. So we'll be in the Vision Park in December this year. So that's our property journey.
Okay, so that's really interesting. I think that really sets the context. I was nervous about my comment on curating, if I'm honest, because actually I'm not sure that's a positive thing at all, because it's not very serendipitous, is it, curating? From a point of view of the ecosystem, Roz, how do you do that? Is it planned? Does it evolve?
Well, the whole thing is about engineered serendipity. That's what we called it in the sort of science park movement. And so what that means is that you need to give people a chance to meet each other. And I found at Granta Park, at Silverstone, and now at Norwich is a lot of the scientists and engineers are introverts. And that means that they probably have some really good things to say, but they need a bit of encouragement. And so you have to find different formats to encourage people to talk with each other and effectively give them permission to talk about what they're working on. And when you do, then good things happen. And it can be, I've found in certain forums that everyone's doing something completely different, but they inspire each other. Something sits in the brain there, and then later on it's useful. And other times people just are suddenly saying, great, I didn't know you were here, I need to work with you. So I've never found that I've run an event where people haven't just really had a good time, either because they've been inspired by the diversity of activity and how hard people are working in other sectors, or they have common problems in different sectors, or they find a way that they want to work with each other. And I think that that's the value, that's the difference between coming to a science park campus compared to going to an industrial estate or business park where there isn't anyone there organising those sorts of networking events and social events as well to get people talking to each other.
From a sort of US perspective, how do you see that as different?
Yeah, well, I think, what Roz has said still rings true from a US perspective, and I think what she did, what NBC did at Granta actually spoke to us. And we're at BioMed and at IQHQ, we're very amenity rich and amenity driven, and so we try to create collision points for that to happen, and trying to get these introverts to bump into each other and talk to each other, and that's how you generate kind of the next idea, the next thought. And so we were able to, with the Illumina transaction I talked about, we were able to supercharge Granta by building the amenity center, which that was the goal for it, was make that happen, and then become used this to attract talent. And so I think curating that did jump off the page when you said it to me, but I think it does happen organically, and when you have the right vision for it as a developer, you can then leverage what we call demand generators, which is, MIT, Harvard, University of Cambridge, things like that, that drive these spin outs and foster that growth. And if you position yourself, you're going to be able to grab a company like Michael's in a market that has more competition than it does today. Today's market is much different than what you're seeing in a more traditional market.
Robert, from a point of view of financing, what is it that you want to see?
Well, I think that one of the advantages of having a great track record of failure is understanding just how difficult it is in our sector. And therefore the focus on how do you improve that. And I think on this point of these interactions, I think one of my observations is why is the University of Cambridge world leading? It's one of the few institutions in this country which is truly world leading. And one of the arguments is historically you'd have the college system. So you'll throw together people from different disciplines and different backgrounds, and they'll be forced to have dinners together and this serendipitous meeting, and that meeting of minds. And I think that concept has grown out of academia into the cluster. Thoughts and therefore this discussion about do we solve the problems by developing a cluster in Manchester or Birmingham or Liverpool, wherever? And I think, well, no, we're in a global market which is incredibly tough, where the odds are stacked against us. We have, in order to maximize it, I think having a cluster where you bring in the advantages of a cluster, we'll talk about some of those, is the only way that the UK can succeed. And Cambridge is poor at many things, fintech, media tech, a lot of these things, that's not our specialty, but where we have got an expertise, let us utilize that. And then, so yes, bring the cluster, but then how do you create an environment within that cluster which encourages these interactions? And that is, personally, you can get very sterile environments in science parks if you're not careful, and where you don't have that vibrancy, where you don't have the interaction, where people drive in, drive out, and you don't have that interaction. So how do we then create environments where you can encourage that, where people actually want to work and want to come in order to attract the talent, it is worldwide talent, attract them to the
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with Michael, and then maybe I've got this here because otherwise I've got camera. I can open this up a little bit wider, but what do you think we're doing right? What do you need more of in order to support that cluster and that collaborative environment?
I think so. One thing I always like to emphasize is this large company, small company partnership, because that's really how Nuclera got off the ground, number one, and number two, proves to our stakeholders that we actually have a market, because we actually serve as our customers mainly large companies, right? Pharma companies, and the ability to interact and connect with some of the large pharma companies that are in our ecosystem has been incredibly valuable for generating requirements lists for products, proving out the marketplace, and demonstrating credibility. So touch points with and networking events with large pharma users is incredibly important in our space and throughout the biotech space, where if you're developing an asset, a clinical asset, what are you going to do in this time when money is short? It's difficult to access capital markets. So you naturally increase the number of partnerships you have. And if you have a large company there that is a source of partnership opportunities, a source of deployment for your devices, then that is perhaps the best ecosystem effect, right? And I fully echo what Robert said about the college system. That's how Nuclera came together at Churchill College, actually, out in the middle of nowhere, actually. But so I think that's what we're doing right. And do you ask what we can?
Yeah, which I imagine is a long list, actually, but
It's a chance to cry.
yeah.
Wow, what could we improve on? Well, more space is definitely one thing. When we went out to look for space, and I suspect that's the same with a lot of report codes, actually, it's now a bottleneck where I know at least 10 or 15 of our peer companies are waiting anywhere between 6 to 18 months to move into their new space. And to the point where recruitment doesn't become an issue anymore, because if you recruit more, you're just spending salary, burning that fixed cost, and not having them able to leave. So that's an incredibly large problem. Another thing that I see with peer companies in the United States, so I'll go into a lot of various facilities and visit them. And one thing I do notice is that it seems like a lot of our peer companies in the States have investments from the people who developed the building themselves, especially Alexandria. So I can name 3 or 4 companies off the top of my head, and they're in assets, clinical assets, biotech, etc. So I wonder if that's a winning strategy. I don't know.
Well, it's certainly been looked at here. I don't know.
Well, I don't-
A little bit more.
Mine used to have a fund. They used to invest when Blackstone bought them. They actually dissolved the fund and then created their own life science fund. Alexandria's fund has been around for a long time. I don't know. There's a lot. I don't know if they invest in you, you have to be in their building. There's a lot. I don't know because I've never been to deal with them. But there's a lot of uncertainty and rumors that fly about it. Like we get a prospect list and there's an Alexandria investor company. We don't need Alexandria all day long.
Right,
In
exactly.
Boston, yeah.
There's a tie-in that's maybe not helpful is what they're saying, I think, but yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the investors, lots of different investors out there. The answer to the question of why isn't there more lab space, you have to look at investor appetite. And to get your investor, and for me, I work with NEPC and make long-term patient capital. To get an investor to put money in, even with deep pockets, you need to put a really good case together. To put a really good case together, you need to do loads of legwork and homework. And then you have to have the courage of your convictions with your detailed paper to put the case to say, we should be spending 20, 30, 40, whatever million building speculatively, because I know there's going to be companies that are going to want to come and pay the rents that I've put in my appraisals. And, I did that legwork at Silverstone time and again, and I enjoyed it. But then, I quite enjoyed hard work and I found it interesting.
We were actually staring, so when we were looking for space between 25 and 30,000 square feet, what we were faced with was, because of no existing available lab space, having to develop our own space, build out, project manage, construct. That's not
I
what
have to
a
say
biotech.
that's crazy.
Yeah, that's not what a biotech, but
Yeah.
that's exactly what, if we land on this deal in the Vision Park, then we would be directly managing a construction project, which is not what you want your CEOs doing. And
So when you look at Sue's graph saying, 1 million square foot of demand, 0 supply, isn't that sufficient to persuade people that there is a?
Well, I think, hasn't it been going in that direction for 10 years, 5 years? And if you couldn't make the case in the last, say, 5 years to build lab space speculatively in Cambridge, then where in the world could you make that case? I mean, I haven't been in Cambridge, right, so I'm casting aspersions. I've been away and I've come back. But yeah, I'm surprised that there weren't more cranes in the sky.
Well, it had a spike. So in 2015, it was 1.5 million square feet, then it dropped, right? And so they don't want to be delivering space when, so the traditional UK investor is risk averse. And so to build a lab building is really expensive and to take on that risk.
Yeah, but fortunately, we haven't got traditional.
Yeah, now people
so-
are coming in. You saw that graph of how many of the investment was overseas, right? There's a lot of US firms coming. So, I mean, you now have people like Longfellow that's come over, and you have Breakthrough that's come over, and Brockton's coming, even though they're London-based. They were educated at HBS and at Harvard. So it's coming. But it's going to be interesting to see. When you look at the trade winds with the capital markets in general. Boston, for instance, Boston has 40 million square feet of laboratory space today. There's 25 million square feet being delivered over the next 5 years. There's 6 million square feet of demand in the market, right? And so not all of it's going to be delivered. So it's, way we look at that as well, right? The best science is going to get the best talent, it's going to get the best capital, and they're going to go to the best locations. So that's what's going to get the balance.
why do you think we don't have a lab central in Cambridge?
They've tried, they've gone through, they've definitely tried here. Johannes hasn't, I think That might be the time for them to do that. I think when he first made an approach, Cambridge is a tight knit network, right? And you know, there is a wonderful laboratory provider incubator down at Abraham, Derek and his team. And so, you know, Tufts has not built theirs on the science park, so you're beginning to see it. Johannes is very busy at Left Central, and so it may just be he came through, he blew through, and he's come back. He may come back. We poked him, we've asked him, we would love to have him come with us, but I don't think they're just there yet.
This is just a symptom of what we see at our company. It's typically much easier and faster to invest in a company than to build space to support that company.
Yeah.
It takes 12 months to build a lab, and you've got the planning system that you're up against as well. So as well as the work that you do to build the case and convince the investor to put the money in, and then you've got to deliver on that. Before that, you've got to battle with the planners, and you know, you can do it. You shouldn't give up, but it takes some tenacity to get the things that you want through to make sense, and get it done in a timely fashion.
I mean, I think the knowledge has built tremendously over the last few years in terms of understanding, from having specialists come into the market and understanding it, who are willing to take the risk, who are also, the market is changing and evolving. And I might just ask Max to comment. He might not appreciate that very much, but just in terms of how the market has changed in terms of understanding specification, and just it's a different language than even 2 years ago.
Well, just two things, right? So a lot of, especially in biotech, companies are going to require some sort of medicinal chemistry. Forget about finding ducted inputs anywhere in the ecosystem right now.
I have 14 in Andover, Massachusetts. I'm trying to get rid of.
Well, let's just move there, right? So,
Well, please don't.
Yeah.
and then the second is clean room space. You have to build that your own,
Yeah.
by yourself right now. So those two are incredibly necessary and somewhat necessary for Clara. When we were going out to try to find ducted fume, we needed to actually build it ourselves, and planning permission required for that.
Yeah.
Forget about it.
No, I mean, it's wrong. It's a wrong use of your time and your.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was my day job to do that in all the places I've been. So, you know, I wouldn't want to have a day job and try and do all of that. No way.
Yeah. So there certainly is space coming through, which is good news. Do you want to just give?
Well, I'll give a little view. I mean, I think one of the questions, the challenges that investors have had in the past, we're up at 1.1 million square foot of demand today. But if we went back to 2020, it's up threefold. We're only at about 300,000. And the challenge you have when Ros is writing those cases to funders is, the depth of that demand. So at 1.2 with zero availability, it's a much easier case than it was 2 years. And unfortunately, property takes a long time to get through the system. And the biggest break in Cambridge has also been planning, because that can add an extra year to 5 years to the whole programme until you've secured that. The great thing is the cavalry is going to come over the hill fairly soon, because we do now have sites in the last 4 months which are committed to be coming forward. Whereas if you'd asked me that question prior to Easter, there was nothing on site for new lab space coming forward. Whereas there's now 3 schemes which are actually on site and another 2 which will probably kick off in the next 6 months. But again, it's a slow process, and it takes a couple of years to then actually deliver those spaces for that demand. A bit of positivity. We've been up at these levels of demand before, back in 2015, so it's not as if it's a flash in the pan because of the pandemic. We have been here before, and we have these cycles. And the great thing about the demand with this subset is that it's a lot more evenly spread. It's not just anchored by an Illumina and another AZ 500,000 square feet.
4 or 5 weekends back
Yeah.
then.
And I think that will make it much easier to write your cases to those developers, that it is a much more robust base of demand, which is going to last for longer. But the other piece is that the market's been shifting in terms of what the occupiers, we think, want, and it is moving to a much more fitted product. Because, like Michael, the last thing that you want to be doing is taking your executive team off to actually deliver a kind of lab fit out project for 6 to 9 months, and it just takes 5-10% of your workforce off doing construction. And the great thing about having a lot more US investment and experts who have done this, because they're probably 10-15 years ahead of us in terms of the products they're delivering, they're bringing that expertise into the market and will be delivering product which is going to be pretty much up and ready for a certain 2/3 of the market demand. But clearly there'll be certain people who will have much more specialist requirements where there'll always be that tweak which is needed. But it will mean that there should be a much quicker entry, and we'll start to see this bottleneck, hopefully.
So, Max, is there a point where there's too much supply?
I don't think there is actually in Cambridge. It's not going to be like Boston because we have certain breaks here which you don't in the US, and the planning system, although we all slightly get annoyed with them, is one of those breaks which means that supply actually is always going to be edging out quite gradually. And if we look at what's committed to date, actually on site, it's only what's about 300,000 delivering in 2024, 3 in 2025. That again, even if demand did say drop by 25 or 50%, we would still be have a complete supply demand imbalance. So that might be a nice problem to have in 27, 28. It's not going to happen anytime soon.
Max, you see the impact of AstraZeneca moving, and have you seen what impact that had on it?
It's huge. It's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is. I mean, the amount of businesses which would, it's a bullseye location if we had more product there. We're actually one of the buildings which is coming forward with 1,000 Discovery Drive. It's only 100,000 square foot. It's oversubscribed many times over by businesses which want to partner next to them, but also partner next to the MRC. That's the other enormous driver. Is that of people who want to partner and be close to those kind of locations. So it's been a fantastic.
My question to Max was a loaded question. So when you look back at Cambridge, Massachusetts in 2005, Cambridge was a rinky-dink town. It wasn't very big. It wasn't that exciting or sexy. Novartis came in, plopped down, made it their headquarters for all of the US, 2,000 jobs. They're now 2 million square feet, and then the whole market just exploded. Then that's what you're seeing happening now.
I think what's interesting actually in Oxford is that Oxford hasn't got AstraZeneca, but what we've seen, we saw a very large increase in the number of spin-outs from the university, and that was really driving probably 75-80% of the requirements across Oxford. But just over the last year, we've seen a large increase in terms of external companies coming in. And I think it's, again, the critical mass. It hasn't got the AstraZeneca anchor tenant, but it is developing that critical mass that is really important to the ecosystem. And actually, interestingly, Milton Keynes is seeing this thing as well. It's a sort of very different market, it's more a tech market, but we're seeing a similar thing going on there as well. Can I open up to others and would be really interested to know, I suppose, what you need, what would be a positive story from the real estate sector? Let's assume that this space can be delivered, because otherwise we could be talking about that one continually. But what else is it that you want from the sector? How can it make really make a positive difference to the life science sector or any other area in which you're working?
Sue, I could ask the question in the meantime.
Yes.
So just come through the slide.
Oh, brilliant, thank you.
To give you thinking time. So as Cambridge expands to cater for demand for lab space, where do you think the most growth will occur? Out to the south, west, north, east, and what will drive this? So over to the panel.
Oh, that's a good question.
Housing.
Yeah.
Schools.
Yeah, well, and the transport infrastructure as well, because your point on Stevenage, but I mean, Stevenage is very, very attractive, actually.
We're actually almost about to move to the Cambridge Research Park. However, when several of our employees heard that a cyclist was killed on the road over the Cambridge Research Park, because you don't want to cycle.
On the A10.
On the A10, right. I don't drive in Cambridge, right? So that's the issue. We just said we can't make this work, so we desperately began searching for other space. Transport links is really critical around Cambridge, especially because the people who were hired for a lot of Cambridge companies came out of Cambridge University and are used to cycling, used to not having a car.
Yeah.
So that's incredibly important.
Yeah, so south, north, east, west, I'd say central.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, places you can cycle to.
I mean, in our YouGov, but our YouGov survey, we asked, what facilities do you want? And we had public transport accessibility way ahead of anything else. And then it's got conference space, meeting space, etc. So it's all about meeting, but first and foremost was accessibility and public transport.
Yeah, I will look at you got Marshall's Airport.
Yeah.
A huge chunk of land.
Yeah,
It's bicycle accessible. To me, who knows what's going to happen or when that'll happen. But I think that you're going to look at an urban development, an urban feel to it. That's when it could potentially happen.
Yeah. And of course, it can go further east, because what we were talking about earlier actually was the you know, it's a gain for everybody in terms of actually when I suppose the collaboration and the science jumps completely or evolves in somewhere else. It's a gain for this sort of wider cluster of community, you know, whether it's a UK or a regional perspective.
Yeah, the reason that that would be the case though at Norwich Research Park is not because companies based in Cambridge need somewhere else to go. If they need to be based in Cambridge, they need to stay at Cambridge. The reason that it's not a zero-sum game, the sort of evolution of Norwich Research Park and the way that that will grow is because it'll be it's a different science. It's a different set of expertise and technology platforms and skills pool that's there. And for me, what I need to do over the course of the next few months and years is make sure that Norwich Research Park is rightfully on the map for the technology platforms, the expertise, the research that's taking place there. Make sure everyone and his half brother is knows about that and is aware of it. And then, yeah, of course, if there are companies in Cambridge that then say, I didn't realise that and that's where I need to be, then they'll come across. But I was at this Eastern Powerhouse dinner last night. It was really good. There was 9 MPs there from the Eastern region and a couple of people from the Lords. And the bit that I said was I've joined because I want to promote Norwich Research Park and the opportunity there, and I know how to deliver that place and make it successful. And but it is not a zero-sum game. It's about promoting that place and generating economic growth there, but at the same time seeing Cambridge flourish and the rest of the Eastern region. And I think beyond that, even we always need to think it's always been a benefit to think about a wider geography and embrace that. The sort of more insular and further down the sort of microscope you look, often the worse off you are. Whereas the wider you can think and the more collaborative you can be, I think the benefits come to all. So that's where I'm going with Norwich. So I'm sorry I'm not there with the full pitch yet, but watch this space and you'll be able to find out more. There's a whole website with all the technology platforms all up to date if you want to find out about that. But yeah, so that's why I think it'll be additive. Yes. And let's hope that it sorts out anyone that says, I didn't know what Norwich did, I wasn't aware of that they then know, and then they have the proper choice of where to locate and grow their business. And we're certainly going to be building lab space speculatively. I'm not waiting for someone to come and say they desperately need it. And I'm not worried about oversupply. I've never felt that you look back, having built a building, and think, oh no, I wish I hadn't done that. Unless maybe you are at Cambridge Research Park on the A10 with people getting knocked off their bikes. I think location is really important. So if the location is really right and ticks all the boxes in terms of transport, housing, quality of life, skills pool, connection to London Airport, you've got all of those things, you're never going to regret building new buildings.
Can I open up to questions in the room, please? Is there anyone?
One point. We use the term laboratory quite freely. One of the concerns I have is the quality of the labs that will be delivered. And there's a huge range of qualities, either under development or promised. And I suggest that in the future, then the lesser quality projects will be the ones that will fail, and companies will migrate or become initially established at the facilities which are truly fit for purpose. And I think the landlords, using that term in the broadest sense in Cambridge, not all of them have grasped that the laboratory is not an office with a vinyl floor.
Absolutely. Your handling.
Yeah.
Number one.
Yeah, it rises.
I think that's a really valid point. You see that a lot with laboratories where it's form over function, where a laboratory space should be functional with the workflow. I mean, the most sort of anecdote that I often spin out, which just always makes me laugh, is the Sainsbury lab is always designed to be square, straight lines. And speaking to the lab manager there, they said that it took them like 6 or 7 months to get a clock in the lab because they weren't allowed a round clock. They had to find a square clock to go with the design of it. And I just thought it was just hilarious because it's sort of, again, I think so many buildings are designed to win awards rather than to actually function as a laboratory space and to a high end. And sometimes it's trying to, I appreciate there's a balance to it, but sometimes it goes the wrong way where it does need to be a functioning space. And then again, from a landlord's point of view, obviously, the more functional it is, the better design. Probably you're more open to different tenants and things when people do outgrow it and move on and stuff. Where if it's a bit too limiting, but I guess it's a balance.
Well, the trick is for an experienced landlord is that lab buildings are they're drawn to efficiency, right? They're drawn to squares and rectangles because that's how you build your labs. If you design the lab correctly, you get the correct error handling, you figure out exactly what systems to put into David's point, what not to, or to draw that line. It's like you make a decent return on the initial investment, an initial tenant. Tenants don't last very long. You talk to Michael, they're going to grow or they're going to go. There's one of the two things going to happen.
Grow.
The average lifespan of a early stage company is about 7 years. One or two things are going to happen, and they're going to explode and move on. And then when they move out, that second tranche of investment that goes back into that lab is actually quite minimal because you're actually just really dressing up the office, which is making it branded to that company. The labs kind of stay the same. They may change a little bit, but overall they change the same. And it's that second turn that as a developer where I sit, that we want a big portfolio so you can then play checkers and checks and move people around to help that growth, really truly asset management.
Yeah, I think that is true in that the experience also that is coming in, you know, that needs experience. It's expensive. So lab development is very expensive. There's an enormous risk there. And actually, one of the points we discussed the other day was in terms of flexibility. Flexibility is really expensive. So and it is the challenge for any developer. But the more experience there is there, the easier that.
I would say as well, though, it's not as complicated as running a biotech company or drug discovery, right? And also, we've been building labs for a long time, good ones and bad ones, and you learn from both. So it shouldn't be beyond the man or women to come up with the right level of, you know, design and fit out and concept that allows a bit of flexibility. And I think, you know, that's something that, again, is just homework. It's legwork. It's looking at buildings. It's understanding.
Managing the cost.
And then, yeah,
that's the cost.
Yeah. But if people are prepared to pay, what is it, £60 a square foot now in Cambridge, then the yields must be really good. Then what's
You had a good deal.
Yeah.
You know,
We like this.
if you can afford to design really good labs in Cambridge, I would suggest.
Boston, it's $150 to $200 a square foot right now. Same reports.
And is that pushing any companies away, or it is? So where would they go then from there? That's an interesting.
Well, only any one outfits that they're moving out into the suburbs.
Just so they won't move to another cluster after that process.
Well, it just goes out. And so actually our first acquisition that we got on our books was of an Andover, Massachusetts, where we have the hoods. Rents there are about $60 a square foot. You don't get big chunks of free rent that you get here. You get a landlord capital allowance that goes towards your fit out for about $200 a square foot there with a 6-month build time. Boston, I haven't heard I have heard 200, but no one's actually transacted on that. I've heard 150. AstraZeneca just did a big deal with Boston Properties at 120, up 130. BioMed did a deal with Takeda, a 137, 225. So they're huge deals. Yeah,
235 Main.
it's across. No, it's the Kendall Square.
No, that one was I think almost 200.
Yeah. Oh, really? Yeah. Well, that's so again, that'll be a smaller space, smaller footprint.
Right.
They're thinking. We'll just talk about the dollars on the line. They're not talking about that per square foot. So you're paying your premium in that smaller space.
Do you think there's any difference in legals between Boston and Cambridge that either the UK or US or vice versa?
Well, the US legal system is based upon the UK legal system. So inherently, it's kind of the same. The deal structures are a little different. Like dilapidations don't really exist there.
Right.
That goes away. They will take bigger chunks of a security deposit in the US than they will over here. The Landlord Tenant Act doesn't exist. So once the lease is up, it's up. You don't have rights. Unless you negotiate rights in your lease, you don't have rights to stay. Once your lease is up, you got to get out. If you don't get out, then there's massive penalties to do that. So there are but inherently, they call things differently. A weight lead is an easement, a CAM charge is a service charge, but inherently they're kind of the same, but there are a couple of nuances that are different.
We found when we were we were originally trying to find some space in Boston, actually, until we worked out a deal with a strategic partner over there. And the amount of landlords that were willing to work with us to do tenant improvements, for example, install a clean room, was me. I couldn't find anyone here to do things like that.
Good, you have my card.
Yes, sorry.
I asked the question about in which direction would you expect Cambridge to grow, and I just sort of wanted to comment on that, in that we are seeing a lot of expansion going on in the south of Cambridge. We've got the Unity campus, we've got plans at Hingston, we know about expansion at Granta and Abraham, for instance. So that's a little bit beyond kind of comfortable public transport and cycling. And also in terms of the housing, we're seeing most housing development going on towards the north and the west. So how do you marry that up, given the answer to the question earlier about it being related to transport and housing?
Well, I suppose it's a challenging one, because there's a difference between where consent may be achieved for the commercial space and where the housing space, and then there can be arguments in many ways. I mean, increasingly, I suppose, so for example, at Welcome, at Harwell, looking at the residential side of it, because that's clearly an important part of that whole story. So I think that probably will continue to grow in terms of trying to make that work. But I think there isn't necessarily it completely joined up from oftentimes from a planning perspective in terms of where the development is happening and that transport link.
I'm just wondering whether there's another driver. We talked earlier about the main driver for people outsourcing and working with each other is to find someone that's close by. Are we actually seeing a bit of a drift in terms of the Cambridge hub out to the south then? And so what's keeping people there and what's driving that expansion to the south is actually this urge to collaborate and be close to each other?
Yeah, no, I think that is the case, isn't it? I mean, Max will probably want to comment on this actually, but it's also massive demand in the city centre as well. So it really depends on the nature of the company, I think, as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is everywhere. I mean, you've mentioned some really big schemes coming on in the south, but if we look up at Cambridge North, there's 500,000 square foot in the planning system for the office and labs, and I expect that the science park will aim to double in size in the next 15 years. It is. There will be huge growth in edge of city, I think, locations too, because I think some of the other teams thought that a lot of people do want to be in urban environments. And the good thing about Cambridge, actually, that the edge of city is probably 15-20 minutes on a bike from whichever point. And I think you'll see huge growth and potentially some premiums being paid from those locations to what would be kind of considered out of town parks at some point. But we don't have that evidence yet because the market hasn't kind of separated between those two levels.
It could be partly down to the investors' interpretation of the market at the moment and that kind of flight to life science investment, and then where is there an opportunity to invest, and like you say, getting planning or having planning available, and then with on the other side then with companies and their requirements going wherever there is something available. So I guess at the moment, because there isn't any lab space available, the first one out of the blocks is going to get a tenant. People are going to move there. But ultimately, in economic terms, the theory is right that people are going to go where it's easy to get out and back and live and work. It's that whole, and I think in Cambridge, it is very much a sort of, that lifestyle of not needing to have a car and drive down the motorway to work, and being able to, and also don't forget the train station and the links from there. And where can you get to from the train station, because that's central, and then you've got the Cambridge North as well, which obviously serves the towns that are connected by the train line, and that's been improved, and I know there's more to do.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, it's still actually Cambridge is very, very small as a cluster compared to Cambridge.
Yeah, scale wise, right? There's max 4 to 5 million square feet of life science lab
so
space.
amazingly successful then, considering the
Yeah.
size of it.
Yeah, Oxford has 1 million and a bit, I think. So you're it's still, in the grand scheme of everything, it's still small, but I don't know if it's good news, but at the end of the day, these issues are all the same issues, whether it's San Francisco, San Diego, or Boston. They're all the same. I mean, we hear it constantly. So I guess it puts you in a lead company, but it still affects your day to day and trying to get it right. The good news is that there's a lot more green space and it's cyclable, which is one of the reasons why I love it so much.
But it clearly hasn't prevented Boston from, its cluster sort of reach is extended. It hasn't pushed off companies going. So
it's pushing out that
Yeah.
the lower, the kind of more blue collar, the warehouse, the shed type location,
Okay,
pushing
so-
that out
Yeah, so,
Which
which is
would-
exactly the same here, yeah.
because land's more expensive.
Can I just raise a question, unless anyone's got one, just on, in terms of manufacturing space and proximity to that, and where, for those where that's relevant, sort of, where that is ideally located, and I would imagine that from a financing point of view, it's important to have that element covered as well, because that's kind of once the R&D is done.
170. I think our larger companies, and probably we've only got two where manufacturing is a real issue. I think the R&D is never, these are high-tech businesses where the R&D is still critical to manufacturing. Therefore, having this as a completely separate, I'll view actually that's not necessarily a good thing.
Right.
So the two examples we have, one is, I don't know if anyone from CMR Surgical, where actually they have built up a manufacturing site and they looked right across Europe and then they decided actually they placed it in Eden. And for the very rationale is not from a cost and not even from a talent perspective, but just have that interaction, at least as I think you presented, having that closeness, at least within a reasonable commute, because I think, high-tech companies, manufacturing is a critical point, and it's not a commoditized, you need to have it close. Our other companies is a semiconductor business, where the business are actually in the northeast, where there is actually the talent and the expertise there, and there has got that better talent pool than there is actually in Cambridge. But there the issue is separating that from the R&D can cause problems, even though it's a lot easier being in the northeast than it was overseas. So yes, I think there is scope to build manufacturing elsewhere, where it can't be too far removed, I think, from that.
Yeah. And from the US perspective, is that a similar story, or?
Yeah, I mean, the case study I like to use is the building in Andover that we bought. We bought it March 6, 2020. The next week, the world fell apart, and we kind of said, "Oh my God, what did we just do?" And it was a fully fitted. It was SI, who's a big Japanese pharmaceutical company. It was their US headquarters. They moved actually to Cambridge. We decided to stick to our business plan and just operate. And that summer, we signed an 88,000 square foot lease with a company called Oncourse, headquartered in Kendall Square, and this is their manufacturing hub. So they didn't want to go. They wanted a 45-minute drive to get to it. And so because of that, we bought the building next door. We're building another 120,000 square foot manufacturing site for it, because it's that we understood and got when we actually had a chance to sit down and talk to Oncourse, because the access to talent. New Hampshire, as Michael knows, is just north, and that's a lot of blue collar kind of working the ship kind of workforce that's there. We'll come down. There's one exit down, and they're in. It's a 15-minute ride, which is what drives that for us.
So for our manufacturing, we actually need a lot of clean room space, typically ISO 6 type of clean room space, and there's just not a lot of availability of that in Canada. Right, semiconductor businesses, very heavy use of clean rooms, and so because of that available investment in the States, that's why we located ours actually in Millbrook, just out about 45-minute drive from central Boston. And so for us, what we really are looking for is ready transport links between Cambridge and Boston, Massachusetts. Actually will be very helpful. And in terms of investments from the States, oftentimes that's a reason why people don't invest, is because they have to fly to Heathrow and take a 3-hour journey up to Cambridge or Oxford in order to visit companies. That's changing because a lot of U.S. investors invest in multiple businesses, so they can visit multiple businesses when they're coming to Cambridge.
So that scale helps.
Direct flight from Stansted.
Okay, so I think I'm conscious of time actually. So I wanted a few kind of lists, to-do lists, sort of briefly, unless anyone's got any more questions. Oh, yes, thank you.
I just wonder if there's too much emphasis on the kind of science park campus type mentality. Having worked in a couple of parks in the area, actually there's very little interaction between the businesses on those parks. So are there brownfield sites in the area that could offer cheaper rent options but aren't necessarily located on science parks?
Would you like the interaction or not?
Well, I've worked on Cambridge Science Park,
Yeah.
Chesterford Research Park, and there's very little interaction. I'm a Unity campus now. There's a lot more interaction, and it's great.
Okay, there you go.
But
Yeah.
but if it's a case of having a space or having interaction, I think most people would probably go for space.
You want both though, really. do you?
Ideally, you want
Yeah,
both,
I was
but if
gonna
it limits your business from growing, what do you do?
Yeah,
Well, in the science park, it's because there's a lot of diversity of business. So there's not necessarily so that the engineering serendipity. There's not a lot of reason for us to talk to Roku, for example, right? But there's a lot of reason for us to talk to AZ or any type of pharmaceutical company, right? So it depends on the types of companies. So just from peers in Boston, I can tell you there is a ton of interaction between companies in clusters, especially around that Kindle area.
I think CIT is a small group, so not constrained the same way as many of the companies, but we were on the West Cambridge site, which is a little bit solar, so just partly because of that, to be much more in the centre, because of our interaction and you can't do that if you're a growing company and rapidly growing, just space does not allow. But how do you create that vibrancy within the science park? It was described some of that, but I think that is something which you need to.
just because something calls itself a science park doesn't mean there's interaction. You need a team on site and people that are there spending their time and effort getting people out, and that's not always easy either. But we know it's good for them. And actually, I've never had someone say, "Why did you waste my time?" Honestly, in 20 years on any of it, it's always been good. So yeah, you can call yourself a science park, but if it's soulless, it's really just business estate, real estate. Whereas if it's got community and activities and amenities and people you can go to, I'd like to meet companies, can you help me? Or one of the things that you said at the beginning about positive that we used to do at Grants Park, I don't know whether you carried on, did you do this? But we had poster events where we had Pfizer and AstraZeneca give a presentation. The leadership teams would come. We'd do it in the afternoon after lunch with a cup of tea and a piece of cake. You always need to get that sort of thing right, otherwise people get really fed up. They don't get a decent. I mean, it depends. Actually, the new generation are interested in that. The student unions around the country, the bars are getting smaller and the coffee shops are getting larger, right? But anyway, that's a separate matter. But the point is that we used to do these poster events where we invite the Babram and the biotech startups, and the reason we did that was not just to support the small startup businesses that needed to talk to the larger companies. It's because the larger companies were saying to me, I get hassled all the time. I'm paying Cambridge rents because I'm in this cluster and I'm being asked who's out there, what's the latest, what's going on, because those large companies are nervous about missing a trick and somebody cool coming along and inventing something that's going to change the world and disrupt their market. So it benefits. There's so many reasons why you'd get all of these different companies of different sizes and stages together, maybe around a theme and a sector, but sometimes just to get people out and getting to know each other.
That's where I think diversity is really helpful. Is diversity in size and similar sectors.
Stage and risk and supply chain.
I'm being looked at to sum up. So I'm going to attempt this in terms of my list. So one is that collaboration. I think density, which is going to be a necessity on a lot of the parks in terms of what's coming forward, will help with that. But it also needs to be worked out. So I think that's one point. in terms of the transport infrastructure, which is a challenge for those in this room, for everybody, but also the scale, we take that, including a link to the States directly from Stansted. So
We're going to help solve that.
yeah, I'll be right.
There used to be one.
You
There
should
was
get,
one.
Yeah.
drop a couple of times and explain.
So,
The only
you know, that's,
expensive Boston,
Yeah,
they
but-
expanded too quickly.
yeah, it's that's a scale. So, thank you very much. There is actually talking drink. I don't know if it's cake, but there is drink out there. So we would be delighted if you would join us. Thank you very much for coming along. From a property perspective, it's been really helpful and we've learned a lot. I hope it's been of interest and we understand a little bit more about where we come from in terms of how we're thinking about this. You know, it's an absolutely fascinating sector, you know, in these broader sense to work on. So we feel very fortunate in that actually. Thank you very much to my panel, who have been brilliant and a really interesting discussion. And we didn't hold back, so I'm pleased about that. And yeah, and please do join us for a drink. Thank you.
That's a good thing.
One thing.